The morning sun caught the silver oak leaves on Colonel Maria Santos's dress uniform as she stepped out of her pristine BMW, and Officer Thompson felt his entire worldview collapse in the space between one heartbeat and the next. For the past 20 minutes, he had been lecturing the woman behind the tinted windows about privilege and responsibility, making assumptions about spoiled rich kids and their expensive toys, never imagining that the person he was humiliating had spent the last 15 years serving a country that included people exactly like him. Maria Santos had been driving to Fort Braxton for what would be her final ceremony as an active duty officer, her retirement papers already signed and filed, when Officer Thompson's flashing lights appeared in her rearview mirror. She had been traveling exactly 2 miles over the speed limit on a stretch of highway she had driven hundreds of times. But something in Thompson's aggressive approach and immediate hostile tone told her this traffic stop would be about more than speed limits. The BMW had been a gift to herself after her 3rd deployment to Afghanistan, purchased with hazard pay and combat bonuses that came at the cost of sleepless nights and memories that would never fade. Every payment had been earned in places where luxury cars were as foreign as the concept of driving without checking for roadside bombs. But Thompson had seen only the gleaming exterior and made his judgments accordingly. If you've ever been judged by appearances alone, if you've ever felt the sting of someone's assumptions about who you are based on what you drive or wear, then you understand why Maria's story matters so deeply. This is exactly why we created Acts of Depth, to explore the moments when our preconceptions collide with reality and force us to see people for who they truly are. Hit that like button if you're ready to witness how respect is earned and assumptions are shattered. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Acts of Depth because stories like this remind us that dignity and service come in forms we might never expect. Maria had grown up in East Los Angeles, the daughter of a mechanic who worked 16-hour days to keep food on the table and clothes on his children's backs. Her father, Roberto Santos, had immigrated from El Salvador with nothing but calloused hands and an unshakable belief that hard work could overcome any obstacle. He taught his daughter that respect was earned through actions, not inherited through circumstances, and that true strength revealed itself in how you treated people who had no power to help or hurt you. The military had been Maria's escape route from a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce and futures often predetermined by zip codes. She enlisted at 18, drawn by the promise of college funding and the chance to prove that a girl from the barrio could excel in any environment if given the opportunity. What she found in the Army was more than career advancement. She discovered a calling that would define her adult life and shape her understanding of what service truly meant. Boot camp at Fort Leonard would have stripped away every assumption she had about herself, rebuilding her from the ground up with discipline, purpose, and an understanding that leadership meant putting others before yourself. Her drill sergeant, a weathered woman named Sergeant First Class Patricia Williams, had seen something in the scrappy kid from Los Angeles that Maria herself hadn't recognized. The rare combination of empathy and steel that separated good soldiers from great officers. Officer Thompson, meanwhile, had grown up in a suburban bubble where success was measured by possessions and status symbols. His father sold insurance and drove a sensible sedan, always reminding his son that flashy cars were for people with more money than sense. Thompson had internalized these lessons without questioning them, developing a worldview where expensive vehicles automatically signaled moral deficiency and unearned privilege. The irony was that both Maria and Derek had chosen careers in service, dedicating their lives to protecting others and upholding principles larger than themselves. But their different backgrounds had led them to opposite conclusions about what those principles meant and how they should be applied in daily interactions with fellow citizens. Maria's BMW represented 15 years of sacrifice, 3 combat deployments, and countless nights spent making life-and-death decisions in places where young Americans died for causes that seemed impossibly complex. Thompson saw only a luxury vehicle that confirmed his biases about wealth and entitlement, never considering that the woman behind the wheel might have paid for it with more than money. The traffic stop had begun routinely enough, with Thompson activating his lights and following standard procedure as Maria pulled safely to the shoulder. But something about the expensive car and the unhurried way its driver complied with his instructions had triggered assumptions that transformed a routine encounter into something more personal and punitive. Thompson approached the BMW with the swagger of someone convinced he was about to teach a lesson to someone who needed teaching. He had no way of knowing that the woman waiting patiently in the driver's seat had commanded respect from soldiers who had followed her orders into combat zones, or that she had earned her authority through actions that most people couldn't imagine surviving. The morning sun climbed higher as both officers prepared for an encounter that would challenge everything they thought they knew about respect, service, and the distance between assumptions and reality. In a few minutes, Officer Thompson would discover that the person he was about to lecture had dedicated her entire adult life to serving the very principles he claimed to represent, and Maria Santos would face a choice about how to respond to disrespect from someone who should have been a professional colleague. Neither of them could have predicted that this routine traffic stop would become a masterclass in dignity, humility, and the difference between earned authority and assumed superiority. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal who these two people really were when their carefully constructed worldviews collided with uncomfortable truths. Officer Derek Thompson's boots crunched against the gravel shoulder as he approached the BMW, his hand resting casually on his service weapon in a gesture designed more for intimidation than safety. The morning air carried the scent of honeysuckle from the nearby fields, but Thompson's mood was already soured by assumptions about the person he was about to encounter. He had pulled over plenty of expensive cars driven by people he considered undeserving of their wealth, and today felt like another opportunity to remind someone about the responsibilities that should come with privilege. Maria Santos watched him approach in her side mirror, noting the deliberate aggression in his posture and the way his jaw was already set for confrontation. 15 years of military service had taught her to read body language like a second language, and everything about Thompson's approach signaled hostility that went beyond routine law enforcement. She kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, following protocols she had learned not in civilian driver's education but in military training about interactions with local police in foreign countries. "Do you know why I stopped you today?" Thompson demanded before Maria could speak, his voice carrying the kind of manufactured authority that young sergeants sometimes used before they learned that real leadership didn't require volume. He leaned down to look through her window, his sunglasses reflecting her calm expression back at her like twin mirrors of his own preconceptions. "I believe I may have been traveling slightly over the posted speed limit, officer," Maria replied, her voice carrying the measured professionalism that had become second nature during years of briefing senior officers and addressing troops under her command. She reached slowly for her registration and insurance documents, movements deliberate and non-threatening. Thompson's eyes swept over the BMW's leather interior, taking inventory of features that confirmed his suspicions about the driver's character. The car was immaculate, clearly expensive, and represented everything he had been taught to resent about people who seemed to have more than they deserved. What he couldn't see was the street Christopher medal hanging from the rearview mirror, a gift from Maria's father before her first deployment, or the small American flag pin carefully placed on the dashboard. "Slightly over the limit," Thompson repeated with a sneer that would have been familiar to anyone who had ever been lectured by someone drunk on temporary authority. "Is that what we're calling 15 miles per hour over the speed limit these days? I suppose when you're driving a car that costs more than most people make in a year, traffic laws become suggestions rather than requirements." Maria felt something tighten in her chest, not from fear but from the familiar sensation of being underestimated by someone who had never bothered to look beyond surface appearances. She had experienced similar assumptions from contractors in Iraq who assumed female officers were less competent than their male counterparts, from Pentagon officials who judged combat readiness by dress uniform appearances, and from civilians who thought military service was somehow easier for people from certain backgrounds. "I understand your concern about traffic safety, Officer Thompson," Maria said, reading his name tag with the kind of attention to detail that had once helped her navigate complex military hierarchies. "I take full responsibility for exceeding the speed limit, and I appreciate your dedication to keeping these roads safe for everyone." Her response seemed to irritate Thompson rather than placate him, as if her calm professionalism was somehow an insult to his authority. He straightened up and walked around the BMW slowly, looking for additional infractions that might justify the lecture he was already composing in his head. The car's pristine condition offered no easy targets, but Thompson's imagination was filling gaps that evidence couldn't support. "Dedication to keeping roads safe," Thompson muttered, returning to her window. "That's rich, coming from someone who obviously thinks money puts them above the law. Let me guess, Daddy bought you this car for your 21st birthday, and you've been racing around ever since thinking rules don't apply to special people like yourself. Maria's military training had prepared her for many forms of disrespect, from enemy propaganda broadcasts that questioned American resolve to foreign officials who underestimated coalition forces based on cultural prejudices. But there was something particularly stinging about being lectured on responsibility and service by someone who had clearly never considered that his assumptions might be wrong. The morning sun was climbing higher, and Maria could see other drivers slowing to stare at the traffic stop, their curiosity adding an element of public humiliation to Thompson's performance. She thought about her soldiers, young men and women who had learned to maintain dignity under pressure far more severe than a hostile police encounter, and drew strength from their example. Officer Thompson, I understand that expensive vehicles can sometimes create incorrect impressions about their owners, Maria said carefully, her voice remaining steady despite the growing insult in his tone. I can assure you that I've worked very hard for everything I have, and I have deep respect for law enforcement and the difficult job you do every day. Thompson laughed, a sound devoid of humor that carried across the highway like a slap. Worked hard? What kind of work does someone like you do? Let me guess, something in Daddy's company where you can show up late and leave early while collecting a paycheck for looking pretty in meetings. The assumption hit Maria like a physical blow, not because it hurt her personally but because it revealed such profound ignorance about sacrifice and service that she almost felt sorry for the man making it. She thought about the soldiers she had lost in Afghanistan, young Americans who had died following her orders into situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between coming home alive or not coming home at all. Thompson was warming to his theme now, pacing beside the BMW like a prosecutor addressing a jury of highway travelers. People like you make me sick, he continued, his voice rising with righteous indignation. You drive around in cars that cost more than a teacher's salary, acting like the rules don't apply to you, never thinking about the people who actually work for a living and have to share the road with your reckless behavior. Maria closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself with breathing techniques she had learned during her first deployment when incoming mortar rounds had tested everyone's ability to remain calm under pressure. When she opened them again, Thompson was still lecturing her through the window, his face flushed with the excitement of someone who believed he was delivering important moral instruction. I'm going to write you a ticket that might finally teach you some respect for the law, Thompson announced, pulling out his citation book with theatrical flourish. And I'm going to make sure this costs you enough that you'll think twice before treating public roads like your personal racetrack. The irony of being lectured about respect by someone who had shown none since the moment he approached her car was not lost on Maria Santos. She sat quietly in the driver's seat, her dress uniform hanging in the back seat just out of Thompson's view, and prepared herself for a demonstration of dignity that would soon turn this encounter into something neither of them would ever forget. Officer Thompson's citation book crackled as he flipped through pages with deliberate slowness, each turn designed to extend Maria's discomfort and emphasize his control over the situation. The morning breeze carried the distant sound of military aircraft from Fort Braxton, their engines creating a low rumble that made Maria's chest tighten with memories of transport helicopters lifting off from forward operating bases in Afghanistan. She found herself thinking about Staff Sergeant James Mitchell, a 23-year-old from Ohio who had died following her orders into a compound that intelligence reports had claimed was clear of enemy forces. The street Christopher metal swayed gently from her rearview mirror as trucks passed on the highway, each movement catching sunlight like the dog tags she had collected from fallen soldiers and personally delivered to grieving families. Maria remembered sitting in the Mitchell family's living room in Cleveland, trying to explain to James's mother why her son had died for a mission that seemed impossibly complex when reduced to civilian language. Mrs. Mitchell had thanked her for coming, for caring enough to make the trip, but Maria had left that house knowing that no amount of military protocol could fill the hole left by a young man who would never come home. Thompson glanced up from his citation book, studying Maria's profile with the satisfaction of someone who believed he was teaching an important lesson. "You're awfully quiet now," he observed, his tone suggesting that her silence proved his point about entitled people who crumbled when faced with real consequences. "Cat got your tongue? Or are you finally realizing that actions have consequences even for people with trust funds?" Maria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign of the storm building inside her chest. She had learned emotional control in situations far more challenging than this roadside encounter. But Thompson's casual assumptions about her character were testing patience she had developed while managing soldiers under combat stress. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her that dignity was something you maintained regardless of how others chose to behave. The highway stretched ahead of them like a ribbon connecting Maria's current humiliation to the retirement ceremony waiting at Fort Braxton, where she would be honored for service that had cost her parts of herself she could never recover. Her dress uniform hung in the back seat, its ribbons and decorations representing deployments, commendations, and sacrifices that Thompson couldn't begin to imagine. The Bronze Star with Valor device had been earned during a firefight where she had personally dragged 2 wounded soldiers to safety while under enemy fire. But those ribbons looked like colored fabric to anyone who didn't understand their meaning. Thompson was taking his time with the citation, clearly enjoying his opportunity to lecture someone he had decided represented everything wrong with American society. "Let me tell you something about the real world," he continued, his voice carrying the condescending tone of someone who had never questioned his own assumptions. "There are people out there working 2 jobs just to keep their families fed, driving 10-year-old cars and hoping they don't break down, while people like you spend more on a car payment than they make in a month." The lecture felt surreal to Maria, who had spent the previous decade living in conditions that would have shocked Thompson into silence. She remembered sharing meals with soldiers who sent most of their paychecks home to families struggling with exactly the kind of financial pressures Thompson was describing. Some of her troops had been supporting parents, siblings, and children on military salaries that barely covered basic needs, choosing service over higher-paying civilian jobs because they believed in something larger than personal comfort. "I suppose you've never had to worry about money," Thompson continued, warming to his theme with the enthusiasm of someone who believed he was delivering social justice through traffic enforcement. "Never had to choose between groceries and gas. Never had to explain to your kids why you can't afford the things their friends have. Must be nice living in a world where everything is handed to you on a silver platter." Maria thought about the months she had spent sleeping on cots in Afghanistan, eating meals from packages that had been designed for nutrition rather than taste, using bathroom facilities that would have seemed primitive to anyone accustomed to basic American amenities. She remembered the weight of command responsibility during her second deployment, when every decision could mean the difference between her soldiers returning home safely or not returning at all. The irony of being lectured about hardship by someone who had clearly never experienced real adversity was almost overwhelming, but Maria maintained her composure with the discipline that had carried her through situations where emotional control meant survival. Thompson's assumptions about her background revealed more about his own limitations than they did about her character, but explaining that would require revealing information she wasn't yet ready to share. Thompson looked up from his citation book again, studying Maria's calm expression with growing irritation. Her failure to react defensively to his accusations seemed to frustrate him, as if her dignity was somehow an insult to his authority. "You know what really gets me?" he said, his voice rising with renewed indignation. "It's the attitude, like you're better than everyone else, like this whole thing is beneath you. That's the problem with people who get everything handed to them. They never learn respect for the people who actually work for a living." The accusation about attitude struck Maria as particularly absurd, given that she had maintained perfect courtesy throughout an encounter that had been hostile from its first moment. She thought about the leadership training that had taught her to remain professional even when dealing with difficult personalities, lessons that had served her well during interagency meetings where military and civilian officials sometimes clashed over policy disagreements. A convoy of military vehicles passed on the highway, their olive-drab paint and purposeful movement reminding Maria of the world she was leaving behind. Fort Braxton lay just ahead, where colleagues and subordinates were probably already gathering for her retirement ceremony. The irony that she would arrive late to her own honor ceremony because of a traffic stop felt like something from a dark comedy. But Maria found no humor in the situation. Thompson finished writing the citation with a flourish that suggested he believed he had accomplished something meaningful. "I'm writing you up for reckless driving, speeding, and failure to show proper respect for law enforcement," he announced, tearing the paper from his book with satisfaction. "Maybe paying a fine that actually hurts will teach you something about responsibility and consequences." Maria watched him approach her window again, his swagger even more pronounced now that he believed he had delivered appropriate justice to someone who deserved humbling. She thought about the ceremony ahead of her, the speeches that would celebrate her years of service, and the medal presentations that would recognize sacrifices Thompson could never understand. In a few moments, she would have to make a choice about how to respond to disrespect from someone who should have been a professional colleague in the broader mission of public service. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the highway that seemed to divide the world into areas of clarity and darkness. Maria Santos sat in her BMW, surrounded by assumptions and accusations from a man who had never bothered to consider that his judgments might be wrong, and prepared herself for a demonstration of dignity that would transform this encounter into something neither of them would ever forget. Thompson approached Maria's window with the citation clutched in his hand like a trophy, his satisfaction radiating from every step as he prepared to deliver what he clearly believed would be the culminating moment of his moral instruction. The paper fluttered slightly in the morning breeze, and Maria could see the excessive fines he had calculated with obvious pleasure, numbers designed to punish rather than correct behavior. She thought about the financial counseling sessions she had conducted with young soldiers, helping them manage money and avoid the predatory lending that targeted military bases, and wondered if Thompson had ever considered that his assumptions about wealth might be completely wrong. "Here's your reality check," Thompson announced, holding the citation just out of reach as he prepared to deliver his final lecture. $650 in fines plus court costs. Maybe next time you'll think twice before treating public roads like they belong to you personally. And let me tell you something else. I don't care how much money your family has. I don't care what kind of connections you think you have. The law applies to everyone equally. Maria accepted the citation with steady hands, noting Thompson's obvious pride in the financial punishment he had imposed. $650 represented more than a week's pay for some of the soldiers under her command. Young men and women who sent most of their earnings home to support families in communities that Thompson would probably never visit. She thought about Specialist Rodriguez, a 19-year-old from Texas who had been supporting his disabled mother and younger sister on an enlisted soldier's salary while serving 2 combat tours in Afghanistan. Furthermore, Thompson continued, clearly unwilling to let this teachable moment pass without additional instruction, I want you to understand that your attitude throughout this entire encounter has been disrespectful and entitled. Real Americans, people who work for what they have, show proper respect for law enforcement. But I guess when everything is handed to you on a silver platter, you never learn basic courtesy. The accusation of disrespect hit Maria like a slap, particularly coming from someone whose behavior had been hostile and unprofessional from the moment he approached her vehicle. She had maintained perfect courtesy throughout an encounter that had tested her patience in ways that enemy propaganda broadcasts never had. Yet Thompson was accusing her of the very behavior he had demonstrated consistently. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so personally insulting to someone who had dedicated her entire adult life to serving others. Thompson leaned closer to her window, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was an intimidating whisper. "You know what I think? I think you've never worked a real day in your life. I think you've never had to earn anything, never had to sacrifice for anyone but yourself. People like you make me sick because you take everything for granted while real Americans struggle just to get by." Maria's knuckles whitened as she gripped the steering wheel, her military training warring with 15 years of accumulated exhaustion from being underestimated, dismissed, and lectured by people who had never spent a single day in service to anything larger than their own egos. She thought about the flag-draped coffins she had saluted, the memorial services she had conducted, the letters she had written to families whose loved ones had died under her command while serving a country that included people exactly like Officer Thompson. "Let me paint you a picture of the real world," Thompson continued, his voice rising again as he gained momentum. "There are men and women out there risking their lives every day to keep people like you safe. Police officers, firefighters, soldiers, people who actually serve their communities instead of just taking up space and consuming resources. But you wouldn't know anything about that, would you? You've probably never sacrificed anything for anyone in your entire privileged life." The lecture about sacrifice from someone who had clearly never considered that his assumptions might be wrong struck Maria as so profoundly ignorant that she almost laughed despite her anger. Thompson was standing 3 feet away from someone who had spent the last 15 years sacrificing everything from personal relationships to physical safety in service to her country. Yet he was lecturing her about the concept of service as if she had never heard the word before. Maria thought about Captain Lisa Chun, a brilliant officer who had been killed by an improvised explosive device while leading a convoy that Maria had ordered into a supply run that intelligence reports had deemed safe. Lisa had been 28 years old, engaged to a teacher from California, planning a wedding that would never happen because she had died following orders that Maria had given based on information that proved to be fatally incomplete. "I bet you've never even met a real soldier," Thompson continued, his voice carrying the smug certainty of someone who believed he had accurately assessed her entire life experience. "Never talked to someone who actually put their life on the line for something bigger than themselves. You probably think the military is just something poor people do when they can't find real jobs." The assumption was so staggeringly wrong that Maria felt something crack inside her chest, like ice breaking under pressure that had been building for 18 months of watching America from the inside while preparing to leave military service. Thompson's casual dismissal of military service as something for poor people revealed ignorance so profound that Maria wondered how someone could function in law enforcement while understanding so little about the people he was supposed to serve. She thought about her retirement ceremony, scheduled to begin in less than an hour at Fort Braxton, where colleagues would celebrate her years of service with speeches about duty, honor, and sacrifice. The ceremony would include a presentation of the Legion of Merit, a decoration recognizing her exceptional service during 3 combat deployments, but the medal would feel hollow compared to the memories of soldiers who had served under her command and never made it home to receive recognition for their own sacrifices. Thompson straightened up and stepped back from her car, clearly satisfied that he had delivered an appropriate lesson to someone who needed humbling. "I hope this citation teaches you something about responsibility and respect," he announced with finality. "Maybe next time you'll think about the example you're setting and try to act like a decent citizen instead of some spoiled rich kid who thinks rules don't apply to them." Maria sat in the driver's seat for a moment after Thompson turned away, feeling the weight of 15 years of service pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Every ribbon on her dress uniform represented missions where young Americans had followed her orders into situations where courage meant the difference between life and death. Yet she was being lectured about service and sacrifice by someone who had clearly never risked anything more significant than his own ego. The morning sun climbed higher as Maria made a decision that would transform this encounter from a routine traffic stop into something that neither she nor Officer Thompson would ever forget. She reached for the door handle of her BMW, her movements deliberate and controlled, preparing to step out of the vehicle and show Thompson exactly what 15 years of military service looked like when it refused to be dismissed by ignorance and assumption. The highway stretched ahead toward Fort Braxton, where her colleagues were gathering to honor her years of dedication to a country that included people who had never bothered to consider that the person they were lecturing might have served that country with distinction for longer than they had been adults. Maria Santos opened her car door and prepared to teach Officer Thompson a lesson about respect that he would remember for the rest of his career. Maria Santos stepped out of the BMW with the fluid precision that comes from 15 years of military bearing, her movements carrying an authority that Thompson noticed immediately even before his eyes registered what she was wearing. The morning sun caught the polished brass on her dress uniform, each button and decoration gleaming with the kind of careful attention to detail that only comes from a lifetime of understanding that appearance reflects character. The army dress blue uniform was immaculate, pressed to perfection, with ribbons arranged in precise rows that told a story of service Thompson had never bothered to imagine possible. Thompson's citation book slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, fluttering to the asphalt like a broken bird as his brain struggled to process what his eyes were showing him. The silver eagle on Maria's collar caught the light, the rank insignia of a full colonel unmistakable to anyone with even basic knowledge of military hierarchy. Below the eagles, rows of ribbons created a colorful testament to deployments, commendations, and sacrifices that transformed Thompson's assumptions into embarrassing fiction in the space of a single heartbeat. "Officer Thompson," Maria said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that had once commanded respect from soldiers in life and death situations. "I believe we need to have a different conversation about service and sacrifice." The bronze star with Valor device glinted among her decorations, a small piece of metal that represented the moment she had run through enemy fire to drag wounded soldiers to safety during an ambush outside Kandahar. Next to it, the combat action badge testified to her direct engagement with hostile forces, while the paratrooper wings above her ribbons spoke to training that most people couldn't survive. Every decoration had been earned through actions that had tested her courage, judgment, and commitment to something larger than herself. Thompson's face cycled through expressions of shock, confusion, and dawning horror as he began to understand the magnitude of his error. The woman he had spent 20 minutes lecturing about service and sacrifice was wearing the uniform of someone who had dedicated her entire adult life to exactly those principles. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like someone trying to breathe underwater, while his mind raced to find words that could somehow undo the damage he had inflicted on himself. "Colonel Santos," he finally managed, his voice cracking like a teenager's as he struggled with the sudden reversal of authority that left him feeling exposed and foolish. I didn't know. I couldn't see." Maria studied his face with the same careful attention she had once used to assess enemy positions and friendly force capabilities, seeing in his expression the genuine shock of someone whose worldview had just collapsed entirely. She felt no satisfaction in his discomfort, only the weary recognition that his assumptions about her had revealed more about American society than she wanted to acknowledge. "You didn't know because you never asked," Maria replied, her tone remaining professional despite the anger that had been building throughout his lengthy lecture about responsibility and respect. "You saw an expensive car and made assumptions about the person driving it, never considering that someone might have earned their possessions through service rather than inheritance." The highway traffic continued its steady flow past them, drivers slowing to stare at the surreal tableau of a police officer who looked like he wanted to disappear into the asphalt, while an army colonel stood beside her BMW in full dress uniform. A convoy of military vehicles passed, their occupants undoubtedly recognizing Maria's rank and wondering why she was standing on the side of the road, being lectured by local law enforcement. Thompson bent to retrieve his citation book, his movements awkward and uncertain as he tried to process the complete inversion of everything he had believed about this encounter. The paper with its excessive fines seemed ridiculous now, a document that testified to his own ignorance rather than any wrongdoing on Maria's part. His hands shook slightly as he held it, clearly uncertain whether he should tear it up or pretend the entire encounter had never happened. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology," Thompson said, his earlier swagger replaced by the nervous deference of someone who understood he had made a career-threatening mistake. "I should never have spoken to you that way. I should never have made assumptions about your background or your character. I was completely out of line." Maria looked at him for a long moment, seeing in his face the same kind of fear she had witnessed in young soldiers who had made serious errors in judgment and were waiting to learn the consequences. Part of her wanted to exercise the authority that her rank represented, to make him understand the full weight of his disrespect through official channels that could end his career. But that impulse was tempered by the understanding that teaching moments were more valuable than punishment when someone was genuinely willing to learn. "Officer Thompson," she said finally, her voice carrying the measured tone she had used when counseling soldiers who had made mistakes that could be corrected with proper guidance. "I'm going to assume that this encounter has taught you something important about making assumptions about people based on their possessions or appearance." Thompson nodded eagerly, relief flooding his features as he realized that Maria was offering him a chance at redemption rather than retribution. "Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. I was completely wrong about everything. I let my own prejudices cloud my judgment, and I treated you with disrespect that was unacceptable regardless of your rank or service record." Maria thought about the retirement ceremony waiting for her at Fort Braxton, where she would be honored for years of service that had cost her relationships, health, and pieces of her soul that would never fully heal. The ceremony would celebrate her achievements, but it would also mark the end of a career that had defined her identity since she was 18 years old. Thompson's assumptions about her character had been wrong in every possible way, but his ignorance about sacrifice and service reflected broader civilian attitudes that made her question whether the country she had served understood the cost of its freedom. "The citation you wrote me included charges for failure to show proper respect for law enforcement," Maria observed, holding up the paper that now seemed like evidence of cosmic irony. "I maintained courtesy throughout this entire encounter, while you lectured me about service and sacrifice without knowing that I've spent 15 years in combat zones serving the same country that employs you. I think we both learned something today about what respect actually looks like." Thompson's face flushed red as he realized the full implications of his behavior. Understanding that he had accused a decorated combat veteran of lacking respect for service while demonstrating complete disrespect for her throughout their encounter. The reversal was so complete that he seemed to shrink physically, as if the weight of his error was pressing down on his shoulders. "Ma'am, would you allow me to tear up this citation?" Thompson asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "And would you accept my sincere apology for everything I said and every assumption I made? I have no excuse for my behavior, and I understand if you want to file a complaint about this encounter." Maria looked at the citation one more time, seeing in its excessive fines and multiple charges the evidence of assumptions that had revealed more about Thompson's character than hers. She thought about the soldiers she had commanded, young Americans who had learned from their mistakes and grown into leaders through proper guidance and second chances. Every person deserved the opportunity to become better than their worst moment, including police officers who had allowed prejudice to cloud their judgment. "Officer Thompson," she said, extending her hand for the citation, "I'm going to keep this as a reminder that we all make assumptions about people we don't know. But I want you to remember this encounter every time you pull someone over, every time you make judgments about a person based on what they drive or how they dress. Service and sacrifice come in many forms, and dignity should be extended to everyone regardless of their apparent circumstances." Thompson handed over the citation with obvious relief, his earlier hostility completely replaced by genuine shame and what appeared to be sincere resolve to do better. Maria tore the paper into small pieces and let them scatter in the morning breeze, watching them blow across the highway like confetti from a celebration she had never wanted to have. "Thank you, Colonel Santos," Thompson said, his voice carrying genuine gratitude mixed with continued embarrassment. "This has been the most important lesson of my career, and I promise you that I'll never forget what you've taught me today about respect and service." Maria nodded and returned to her BMW, sliding behind the wheel with the same calm competence she had maintained throughout the encounter. As she drove away toward Fort Braxton and her retirement ceremony, she could see Thompson in her rearview mirror, standing beside his patrol car and staring after her with the expression of someone whose entire worldview had been reconstructed in the span of 20 minutes. The morning sun climbed higher as Maria Santos drove toward the final ceremony of her military career, carrying with her the satisfaction that comes from maintaining dignity in the face of disrespect and choosing education over retribution when someone demonstrates genuine willingness to learn. Behind her, Officer Thompson was beginning an education about service, sacrifice, and the danger of assumptions that would reshape how he approached every encounter for the rest of his career. Stories like Maria's remind us that true strength often goes unrecognized, that dignity maintained under pressure reveals more about character than any uniform or decoration ever could. In a world where we're quick to judge based on appearances, where assumptions fill the gaps that conversation could bridge, maybe the most radical thing we can do is approach each person we meet with the understanding that we know nothing about their struggles, their service, or their story. Every interaction is an opportunity to choose respect over prejudice, curiosity over assumption, and recognition over dismissal. If this story has moved you, if it's made you think about how you see the people around you, then it's accomplished something important. Share Maria's story with someone who needs to remember that honor and sacrifice come in forms we might never expect. And remember that the next person you meet might be carrying burdens you can't imagine while serving purposes you've never considered. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come disguised as ordinary moments, and the greatest teachers are the ones we almost overlooked entirely.